Hey everybody, hope you're doing well this afternoon. Welcome to Dudes Talking episode 28 from 9/11 to 11/9. We're going to have a very, very interesting take on 9/11 here today that many people probably have not heard of. And some of it is going to be some things that other people are saying, like the Antidote podcast to some degree as well. Shout out to Greg McCarran and Jeremy Roth-Cushell. Shout out to the Antidote boys. I appreciate the body of work that you guys have done and continue to do. But today I have here with me George from cavdev.org, a dear friend of the show. How are you doing today, George? You doing well?
Yeah, I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing good. So I got CavDev up there. I definitely recommend anybody who's a researcher to go visit cavdev.org, especially if you're looking into election fraud, Franklin scandal, the finders, a lot of pedogate research is also over there too as well. That George catalogs. So today, George, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about 9/11 and how it has connections to but both the connections from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Council for National Policy. Now, there are many different power players when it comes to who was involved in 9/11. You have the CFR, you have the CMP, you have the Israeli Mossad, you have the Five Eyes, you have Saudi Arabia, and you have Russia. Those seem to be the major power players. I'm not forgetting any offhand, am I? George, you
I
can think
mean,
of?
Pakistan's very important
Okay.
too. The ISI has been a CIA money funnel for a long time for these Islamist groups.
Yeah, Pakistan as well. And so there's Alex Jones. He used to talk about Mossad every once in a while in their relation to 9/11, but he used to harp a lot about the Five Eyes or the Anglo-American establishment being involved in it. Bush, Cheney. And everything, but now he doesn't talk about that at all because of Council for National Policy member and ardent Zionist David Horowitz, who runs the Freedom Center, has convinced Alex Jones that the 9/11 attacks were primarily done by the Saudi Arabian hijackers, and that no one else was involved. And that's pretty much what Alex Jones does now. Is he toes the party line about that. I mean, you even see that in mainstream news with Trump's going to release the rest of the Saudi Arabian was supposed to release the rest of the Saudi Arabian proof of their involvement within 9/11. And of course, Tulsi Gabbard now saying that she's going to do it because Trump didn't do it. And Tulsi Gabbard, being tied to the Council on Foreign Relations, being cozy to the Council for National Policy, as well as being cozy to Putin and Russia. So it's very interesting when you see all that of how Alex Jones went from there's a lot of trying to possibly investigate 9/11. I always think he was a CMP plant. Look at my video, was Alex Jones ever our guy on the channel? But yeah, so he was gone from looking at Mossad possibly every so often, looking at the Five Eyes, looking at Anglo-American establishments involved in 9/11, to it strictly being the conventional narrative story of the Saudi Arabian hijackers and Saudi Arabia being involved, and Osama bin Laden being involved primarily, and the 9/11 attacks. It's very, very sad. So what do you have to say about all that, George, before we get on to our combined new narrative of looking at 9/11 in a whole different light?
Yeah, I think that you make an excellent point, and Alex Jones is pretty much going in line with what the political and media establishment's been pushing from the beginning. With 9/11 and with any major conspiracy, there are multiple different layers of controlling the narrative, and so you have a couple different limited hangouts that each reveal a bit more of the story, but are still hiding crucial aspects. And the whole thing with Saudi Arabia and the hijackers and the 28 pages that you mentioned, like that's a little piece of the story. And of course, Saudi Arabia, Saudi intelligence, and high-level people in the Saudi government were involved in handling the hijackers at a certain level. But when you stop there, as people like Alex Jones do, or as people like Bob Graham and Tulsi Gabbard do, you're essentially hiding nearly all of the story and looking at Saudi Arabia in isolation without concentrating on the question of who is actually above them and who's actually handling them. And the reality of our deep political system is that really none of this stuff occupies a vacuum. It's Saudi government, Saudi intelligence is deeply enmeshed with U.S. intelligence operations, Israeli intelligence operations, and what you see with the hijackers is that the Saudis were almost certainly operating at the behest of these other agencies, and that many of the supposed hijackers themselves were double or triple agents for other intelligence organizations like the CIA and Mossad. So there's a quite large international network that gets completely brushed aside when you only focus on one country. And indeed, it turns out that, even the small revelations about Saudi Arabia's role are pretty much kept hidden unless we have some imminent need to threaten the Saudi government. Kevin Ryan, who does excellent 9/11 work, did an interesting analysis of this, and he found that basically anytime the Saudi government changed or anytime they stepped out of line with U.S. policy, Bob Graham would suddenly threaten to declassify some of these 28 pages, and then the Saudi government would, step back into line. So this limited hangout has a lot of purposes to misdirect our attention away from the big picture, and also as sort of a tool to keep this deep political system in check.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. I agree with you, George, 100%. So why don't we get start? I guess with some of the less known narratives and less known reasons and less known involvement of people within 9/11. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean that's there's definitely quite a lot to say about it, but I think that one of the biggest and best indications that the conventional story of 9/11 and even some of the more limited hangouts are not exactly what don't match up with the reality is if you look at the background of Mohammed Atta, who is the so-called lead hijacker of 9/11, who allegedly flew a plane into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And there's really only one person who actually bothered to do actual investigation into the background of Mohammed Atta, and that's investigative journalist Daniel Hopsicker. And Daniel Hopsicker, saw in these various news accounts that Mohammed Atta had taken flying lessons at a school in Venice, Florida called Huffman Aviation. And Daniel Hopsicker found it kind of interesting because his parents had retired to Venice. It seemed like a sleepy old community in Florida, and he was wondering why exactly would hijackers from the Middle East go to Venice of all places and start training how to fly. So he found this topic interesting, and so he went to Venice and actually started digging into these flight schools and who was responsible for running them. And he found that basically the fingerprints of U.S. intelligence were everywhere in Venice, Florida, and on these flight schools. Huffman Aviation, which is where Mohammed Atta trained, it's also where the a hijacker of the flight that flew into the South Tower, Marwan al-Shehi, trained, and Marwan al-Shehi and Mohammed Atta were traveling together quite a bit. So both of these hijackers trained at this flight school, which was run by a man named Rudy Deckers with the financial backing of Wally Hilliard. And Wally Hilliard was a retired businessman from Green Bay, Wisconsin, who had come down to Florida and then started opening up all these aviation businesses. And Daniel Hopsicker came to realize that both Rudy Deckers and Wally Hilliard were deeply enmeshed in drug trafficking, you know, and most likely had CIA connections as well as Russian mob connections. And for instance, Wally Hilliard, one of his aviation companies, Plane One Leasing, had been busted in July of 2000 for flying heroin from South and Central America up to Brighton Beach, New York, and Brighton Beach is well known as a Russian mafia enclave. So, one of Wally Hilliard's planes was being used for this drug flight. The two people, one of the people flying it was named Mike Brassington, and who was the son of a Guyanese businessman who had worked with Russian aluminum oligarch Oleg Deripaska. The person on the receiving end of the flight was another Russian mafia player named Igor Rabayev in Brighton Beach. So, this guy, Wally Hilliard, had all sorts of organized crime connections, and he also had numerous political connections. He had people like Jeb Bush and Catherine Harris, the Secretary of State down in Florida, endorsing his flight. He had given a loan out to CNP member and, religious right prominent figure Jerry Falwell, given Falwell a loan and never asked for it to be paid
Oh,
back.
now, George, Jerry Falwell would never take any dirty laundered money. He would never do anything like that. He was a good Christian man. Now, George, how dare you say something like that?
Oh, yeah, yeah, I'm sorry. I guess I stepped out of line by saying that. And, he was also involved in this aviation enterprise in Virginia with Jerry Falwell as well, which, gathered a lot of suspicion because people were wondering why this tiny company out of Florida was able to have such influence in this aviation company in Virginia. So he also had connections to Bill Clinton and also Adnan Khashoggi. He was involved in some suspicious ventures in the Bahamas with Khashoggi. So Wally Hilliard is basically a very, very well-connected guy, and he was involved in drug flights that had the involvement of the Russian mob and all these other suspicious players. So to see someone like Muhammad Atta going to train at this flight school that seems like it has a blatant CIA connections and organized crime connections was very curious to Daniel Hopsicker. And then as he continued to dig into Muhammad Atta's connections, he also found other things. Like he found Muhammad Atta's girlfriend, Amanda Keller, and learned from her that Muhammad Atta's closest associate in Venice, Florida, that it was not an Islamist, wasn't a crazy, jihadist or anything. His closest associate was actually a German man by the name of Wolfgang Boehringer. And Wolfgang Boehringer had a history of running flight schools in Germany. He was part of the Flying Club of Munich, and then he started a bunch of businesses. One of Wolfgang Boehringer's businesses was with a man named Dirk van der Meyden, and Dirk van der Meyden had flown for the Kingdom Holding Company, which is a big Saudi conglomerate run by Prince Al Walid that owns various corporations like Citigroup and Apple Computer. So, Boehringer was hooked up with this international criminal element as well. And at one point, Wolfgang Boehringer went over to Fanning Island to start another flight school. He was arrested after the FBI put out a terror alert due to his association with Atta. And after he got arrested, his first words to his captors were, "You can't arrest me. I'm working with the CIA." So these are the people who Muhammad Atta was hanging out with in Venice, Florida. It wasn't these terrorists. It wasn't
He
Islamists. It
wasn't going to
was
he wasn't going to strip clubs. That
Oh
wasn't
yeah,
happening.
well that was another big deal that, the whole narrative of Muhammad Atta as this devout Muslim who was willing to die for his beliefs in a suicide mission, that was pretty blatantly contradicted too by the fact that he engaged in pretty much every un-Islamic activity you could, dating this dating this American girl who was I think she was a stripper. Amanda Keller, his girlfriend, he was going to strip clubs. He was consuming a ton of alcohol, getting drunk and belligerent, and threatening people at the bars. So Muhammad Atta was, and snorting cocaine. Muhammad Atta was not a devout Muslim, as Hopsicker was able to find out. He clearly was not what he was being portrayed as, and what Muhammad Atta truly appears to have been is not this jihadist. Muhammad Atta was almost certainly an intelligence operative for the U.S. government and potentially other intelligence agencies as well, and was most likely working with this criminal element that Wally Hilliard and Rudy Deckers were supervising to run drugs. Because what's interesting is that Muhammad Atta didn't actually need to learn to fly. He had already taken flying lessons. He already knew how to fly. So why exactly is he going to this flight school when he doesn't actually need to learn how to fly? And the very likely reason and what he was probably actually up to is that he was one of the many drug pilots who was being employed by Wally Hilliard's enterprise. And Marwan al-Shehi was often considered to be Muhammad Atta's bodyguard. Atta would often go around saying that he was a Saudi prince, and Marwan al-Shehi would present himself as his bodyguard. So that seems to have been the real arrangement. The two of them weren't there for training for hijacking missions. They either knew how to fly planes already or they didn't even have any real intention of hijacking these planes. What they were really here for, almost certainly, was for drug running. And that's confirmed by the numerous connections of Hilliard, of Boehringer. I think that is the clearest piece of evidence that really shoots a hole in the entire official narrative by seeing that the lead hijacker is actually someone working for U.S. intelligence and working with the Russian mafia to smuggle drugs.
I mean, how many times does that play out? Like how many? Barry Seal, like Freeway Rick Ross, like Benito Plandone. Like how many times? How many times does the CIA traffic drugs?
Well, yeah, pretty much every case. I mean, almost any major drug trafficking case, you can look at it, you find hidden CIA involvement. And it's funny that you bring up Barry Seal because there's actually a direct connection between Barry Seal and the flight school that Wally Hilliard was running. Wally Hilliard got a lot of his planes from the infamous Whittington brothers, Don and Bill Whittington, who were race car drivers and then eventually got busted in a marijuana dealing scheme, went to jail for a while, and then in about 2013 they got busted again. They were continuing to smuggle drugs, and the Whittingtons ran a company called World Jet Inc., and at least one of Wally Hilliard's planes came from World Jet Inc. And meanwhile, Barry Seal also got one of his planes from the Whittington brothers from their aviation company fronts. So there's actually a direct overlap between this Iran-Contra crowd with people like Barry Seal and the Huffman Aviation crowd with people like Wally Hilliard. And in fact, the what Daniel Hopsicker found and what other researchers like Jonathan Elenoff also found is that the history of covert operations in Venice, Florida goes back decades. The airfields in Venice, Florida were being used for anti-Castro Cuban groups. The CIA was training during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Then during Iran-Contra, the Venice, Florida airfields were being used for drug flights, much like Mena, Arkansas was. And in fact, one of the most powerful Arkansas businessmen, Jackson Stevens, who was a benefactor of both the Bushes and the Clintons, had a major company, a major presence in Venice, Florida during that time. And another CIA operative who was overseeing the whole thing in Venice during the Iran-Contra period was Porter Goss, who would eventually become the CIA director. And Porter Goss has a bunch of interesting connections. He was actually seen in a photo with Barry Seal in a Mexico City nightclub that Daniel Hopsicker dug out. So he was likely in that whole CIA assassination squad of the 1960s with other people like Felix Rodriguez, Barry Seal, Frank Sturgis, etc. Porter Goss actually was part of the U.S. Congress, and he was representing the same district where the Venice, Florida Flight School was. He was a protege of Bob Graham. The two of them ran the congressional investigation into 9/11, which basically came up with all these foreign government connections and then pretty much buried them, except for the convenient controlled disclosures that I talked about earlier about Saudi Arabia. So, and then Porter Goss eventually became CIA director, and while he was CIA director, one of the people working under him was involved in Dusty Foggo was involved in some sexual blackmail scandals that may have linked to Abramoff. So Porter Goss has a long storied history, and he was involved with this whole Venice, Florida milieu as well. So the history of intelligence ops in Venice goes back a long ways, and it's just one of the most interesting places for Muhammad Atta to end up at, and there he is. So that really just is what I would consider the clearest evidence that the 9/11 story is not what we've been told. And Venice, Florida is also a good starting point for all these other, international connections of the 9/11 attacks, because it goes off in so many different directions and illustrates all these different actors who were really involved.
Yeah, George. One thing about Porter Goss, he was also a Council on Foreign Relations member, which is very interesting about the Bushes. They kind of flirt both with the Council for National Policy and the Council on Foreign Relations more with George H.W. Bush than George W. Bush, who seemed to rely more on the CMP, and who met with him in 1999 before he was elected to president to give him a pitch of why he should become president. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. They were saying the same things about the CIA under George W. Bush that they're saying now, because Goss was leaving, kind of went in there as the hitman to fire a whole bunch of people, kind of to clean house of the CIA, similar to what some people are saying that's going on in the Trump administration now too, as well, with Trump cleaning out the intelligence agencies. And I would say that just as much as Bush did not do that, Trump is not doing it either. So Porter Goss, he was a CFR member, but he. I guess my main saying is let me discuss something. We'll go further on what you're talking about. So many people in our audience are much aware of the Project for New American Century. Okay, it was like a neoconservative think tank that was formed in Washington, D.C., that focused on United States foreign policy. It became one of the biggest think tanks as far as the later push into the invading of Afghanistan and then the invading of the Second Iraq War. And some people say that may have been where a lot of the information, as far as like the planning for the regime change in Iraq to occur after 9/11. So I went and looked at the different members of the Project for New American Century to determine whether or not they're Council for National Policy members, or to determine if they're Council on Foreign Relation members. Because most people in the alternative media, as you're well aware, George, they would say, the Project for New American Century are full of neocons, neoconservatives, and some people would say, and I've seen it in books where, well, yeah, a lot of those members were Council on Foreign Relations members and the New Americans Project for New American Century, so that's why, go globalism, you know what I mean, George?
Yeah.
So with the Project for New American Century, what I found through my own research, and everything is that they were equally broken down almost, of members that were both in the Council for National Policy and members that were in the Council on Foreign Relations, and actually many of them overlapped. So the CNP members that we have that were in the Project for New American Century are John Bolton. Of course, everybody knows Bolton. I don't know how to tell you who Bolton is. Paul Wolfowitz, who is, some people could say is one of the grand architects, and grand as a Masonic term, because he definitely was an evil human being, in my opinion, who came up with the whole the Middle East wars and a theory for the invasion of Iraq. Steve Forbes. Steve Forbes is a billionaire, runs Forbes magazine. Norman Potterest, who was good old Norman, was a famous. He was a famous like a pundit and author. And he was a neoconservative, and he's been around for the longest time. His son John Potterest, as well. Both of them are avid Zionists. And then you have Dan Quell, former vice president under George H.W. Bush, and Gary Bauer. And then as far as speakers in the CNP, but not really members who were part of the Project for New American Century, you have Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, R. James Woolsey, and Frank Gaffney. And then possible people that may have been in the CNP, but I can't completely confirm it, is Stephen Peter Rosen, Thomas Donnelly, Gary Schmidt, and Elliot Abrams. Of course, Elliot Abrams would be very much involved with Iran-Contra, would he not, George?
Yeah, I mean, he was one of the big people who lied to Congress, and he was supposedly in the supposed humanitarian shipments to Nicaragua. He was really putting in weapons, and of course, he's been accused of the exact same thing in Venezuela recently and denied it about as convincingly as he's denied it back in the 80s. So, yeah, he's a big player involved with the Bush cliques schemes to overthrow governments, and so it's very telling to see all these people here. And PNAC's entire document about rebuilding America's defenses has definitely received a lot of focus in the 9/11 research community, and for good reason, because they basically outlined exactly what the Bush administration was going to do after the 9/11 attacks. And that's one of the key things to keep in mind, that it's not as if these wars were some sort of hastily created reaction to this foreign threat. It was clearly planned out even before the George W. Bush administration was a thing. And the fact that these people in and out of government from both wings of the deep state, the CFR and the CNP, were already making plans to have a permanent military presence in these foreign countries, in Iraq and Afghanistan, all throughout Central Asia and the Middle East. They were already essentially coming up with these imperialistic global domination schemes, and that 9/11, which would come several years later, was just the catalyst that they were all wanting. And in fact, they said outright that that's what they wanted. They said that an event such as a, quote, new Pearl Harbor would be exactly what they needed in order to get the American public on their side. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is more associated with the CFR clique, said much the same thing in his book, The Grand Chessboard, that there needs to be a, quote, direct external threat, unquote, in order to get the American public to support Zbigniew Brzezinski's plan for constant U.S. occupation abroad, for empire, essentially. So the motives of these different power players were very, very clear from the beginning, and 9/11 is exactly the event that they wanted, and it's exactly what allowed them to create this permanent overt war posture that really hadn't existed up until that point.
Oh, very much so. And then you have the CFR members, the Council on Foreign Relations, Elliot Abrams, Robert Zoellick, which of course I said Elliot Abrams may be also in the CNP just because connections are Iran-Contra. A lot of these people, they go back and forth, which gives further credence, does it not, George, that, these organizations are really just window dressing, and that it really, they're all compartmentalized to some degree, but it's more of like an arcing pyramid where, the top down gives orders, you know what I mean? They may have disagreements here and there, people within the CMP or the CFR, different factions and stuff. But when it comes to something like 9/11, they're both in agreement, wouldn't you say?
Well, yes, of course, and that's really the case with many of these. The CFR and the CNP are sort of part of what I guess I'd call the governing body of the deep state, and within any organization, like with any sort of overarching system like this, there is always going to be disagreements on exactly what the policy should be, on exactly what they're going to focus on. For example, disagreements over whether Central Asia or Iraq is a more important target, but what they all agreed on was that we need this catalyzing event that we can use as an excuse for indefinite military action and indefinite military occupation. And clearly, there's this higher power above them both, which was totally interested in global domination and corporate profit, was really pulling the strings. And you can see that in the fact that so many of these CFR and CNP members are in fact overlapping, that they actually do play both sides. And to whatever extent they really oppose each other, they're all essentially on the same side of being opposed to us and being in favor of their own enrichment.
Oh, very much so. Robert Zolek, Douglas J. Feith, Paul Wolfowitz, again, Richard Pearl, who's also a member of the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission, Robert Kagan, whose father Donald Kagan was also in the Project for New American Century, Gary Schmidt, and Thomas Donnelly, again playing both sides. They were CFR members. So yes, when it comes to the Project for New American Century, they'll demonize it and say, look at all these CFR members, including I forgot Krauthammer, Charles Krauthammer. Being CFR too as well, and then you have the main guy who's they say is who developed the Project for New American Century, which was William Crystal, being a neoconservative pundit and author. He was a Council for National Policy member. So it's just very interesting that you see that you have both sides. The CNP side is never talked about. No one will ever say the CNP had involvement in 9/11 except for Josh Reeves, you and I. The Antidote podcast, that's really about it. And so as far as the Project New American Century is concerned, which is the blueprint for the Iraq War, the blueprint for 9/11 to occur, a new Pearl Harbor, in my opinion, and yours, when you mentioned earlier too, George, that the CNP and the CFR were both very much involved. Both the right and left parts of the deep state were both very much involved. And that's something you're not going to hear from Alex Jones, because the CNP is the most secretive organization that Alex Jones never told you about.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Well put.
All right, go ahead and let's continue.
Sure. I mean, like I background
Hey,
of
hey,
these
George.
Mujahideen.
Sorry, can you start over? We had an audio issue. I apologize about that.
Oh,
Go ahead.
yeah.
You were talking about how the CMP members of it were involved in 9/11. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, CNP was that whole block was such an important group behind Iran-Contra, and there's a major continuity from Iran-Contra to 9/11, as we've already talked about. When you see people like Adnan Khashoggi showing up in the background of these Florida flight schools, or you see Richard Armitage as one of who deeply involved in covert operations and to enable drug trafficking, him showing up in setting up drug routes in Central Asia that Dick Cheney's company Halliburton was using, and then also meeting with the chief of the Pakistani ISI shortly before 9/11, or Richard Secord setting up these private ventures in Azerbaijan to take over their oil industry. All of these players from the Reagan Bush era show up in 9/11 and show up in the prelude to 9/11. So it's obviously very significant to include all of these people, and especially the CNP angle.
There'll be other CMP people too that we talk about, George, here very shortly. Some more members of the CMP that we're going to discuss that have the involvement in 9/11. Of course, we're going to discuss the Russian angle. We're going to discuss more of the Mossad angle. Because there are many different angles within 9/11, many different intelligence organizations with 9/11. Of course, Alex Jones doesn't even talk about Larry Silverstein anymore, too, as well. It's very interesting how he's completely cut Larry Silverstein out of 9/11. Like Silverstein had no involvement whatsoever.
Oh God.
It's just crazy, I mean, yeah, who owned those Twin Towers there, Alex? Who scammed the insurance? But anyway, so go ahead and continue.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many connections that it's not always easy to, pick one and, stick with it because there's so many roads you can go down. But I think some of the other interesting connections that you see when looking at the hijackers in Florida, people like Muhammad Atta, is first of all the Mossad, spy ring that was made up of supposed art students, and that's another one of those big things from 9/11 that doesn't really get focused on as much, at least in certain by certain people like Alex Jones. And just as I mean, Muhammad Atta was almost certainly a CIA asset working for this drug smuggling ring, but the involvement of Mossad and these art students tells another interesting story and another angle to this whole thing. Basically around 2000 to 2001, there was a big explosion and a huge influx of people from Israel claiming to be art students, and they had this totally non-existent university listed as where they came from, and they would go around to DEA, to Drug Enforcement Administration offices, DEA offices, and basically try to gain access by saying, "Hey, we're art students. We're selling art." And this became such a huge epidemic across the country that the DEA started taking note of this, and they put it in a report. But this report was kind of just brushed under the rug. It wasn't never really became public until it got leaked eventually. And there were a couple interesting things about this spy ring, this likely Israeli intelligence spy ring. And one of the first things is that they had connections to the international drug trade as well. One of these Israeli spies who got his property searched, they found that he had phone numbers that came up in an existing DEA investigation into the ecstasy trade. And what's interesting is that many news reports from the time period say that the ecstasy trade was very heavily dominated by Israeli and Russian organized crime groups. So to see this spy ring have an overlap with this ecstasy operation is very interesting.
What, you
And
telling me, pushing a highly damaging drug, MDMA, especially if it's not pure, if you're not taking in pure MDMA, has a strong risk of causing many neurodegenerative side effects over time, as well as neurotransmitter imbalances over time. Israel and Russia pushing that and being a huge trade market around the world for that, George. No, that could never happen, right? I mean, Alex Jones tells us Russia's the good guy, Putin's the good guy. They're saving civilization. Now, how could that be?
yeah, I know it's hard to believe, but that's apparently what's come up. 9/11 hijackers around the country, and it's not super definitive whether they were doing this, but there's a lot of curious evidence pointing to the fact that the spy ring of art students was in fact keeping tabs on the hijackers, during 2001, right before the attacks actually occurred. And the way that this came out is kind of interesting and sort of points to some internal conflict within the deep state, with people like Dick Cheney trying to make other limited hangouts of what happened on 9/11. There was a story from Fox News in December of 2001 that really pushed this story very hard. It had I think Britt Hume was the main person behind this, and supposedly, according to some of the inside sources who talked to Mike Rupert, the author of the book Crossing the Rubicon, Dick Cheney leaked this DEA report to Britt Hume of Fox News, and then the Fox News ran a big story on this saying, well, look, Mossad was following these hijackers right before the attacks, and they didn't do anything. They didn't warn us properly, so or did they withhold this information from us? And Fox News sort of blew it up into a mini scandal, but they kind of brushed off the fact that that Mossad had in fact given the U.S. very clear warnings in advance. They hadn't withheld anything, but the U.S. government didn't even bother to look at these warnings. And what really seems to have happened is that the U.S. government, the U.S. intelligence infrastructure, and Mossad were both aware of this operation and were allowing it to go forward to keep monitoring these hijackers. And so that was one of the big things that really kickstarted the scandal. At one point, a pro Israel newspaper actually admitted, like, yeah, the spy ring was following the 9/11 hijackers, but that's a good thing, right? Because it's just a helpful ally like Israel keeping tabs on the evil Islamists who are out to
Of course, George,
destroy America.
the greatest ally. That's what the Fourth Estate wants us to know. They're our greatest ally, not England. Even though I have problems with the Queen and stuff like that, but as far as America's roots and everything, not the English people. No, 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 no. Israel's our greatest ally. So they would never. Of course, you'd want them to go pay attention to those hijackers. I mean, they're keeping tabs on them. They gave us information about them. I mean, that's what you'll see through this whole entire thing is them trying to definitely downplay the Mossad connections and the Russian connections on top of that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it was interesting to see that at one point it was basically just admitted outright that, yeah, the spy ring was keeping tabs on these so-called hijackers, people like Atta and etc., but it was for a good cause. So don't worry about the fact that Mossad's running a spy ring inside the US that is trying to gain access to these government facilities and all that. So it was kind of admitted at one point that that's what they were doing, but again, the press barely took any notice of them. There were only a couple stories, and one of the most curious things that came out was that at one point, this Israeli spy ring basically lived on like the same street where in Hollywood, Florida, where Muhammad Atta was living, like basically only, blocks, probably not even blocks away, like very, very close to where these hijackers were. So that there's a direct correspondence between what the spy ring was, where they were, and where the hijackers were. And as we've established already with the activities in Venice, Florida, I mean, I'm saying hijackers is sort of a shortcut for people like Muhammad Atta, even though I'm not 100% convinced that that's what they really were on 9/11. What's clear is, though, that these people were in the U.S., they were up to something, and what they were really doing for the most part was drug running, as we've established already. Muhammad Atta was involved with this group in Venice that was dealing with the CIA and dealing with the Russian mob. And so now, if he's down in Hollywood, Florida, and being tailed by these Mossad agents, and we already know that this group of art students is itself involved in drug trafficking with presumably Israeli organized crime and Russian organized crime, the same milieu that Atta is already connected to, it starts to raise a very interesting question of whether these Mossad agents were actually another sort of layer of handlers for these hijackers in the U.S., if they were actually directing them around and using them in the drug trade, as it seems that's what was going on. Wally Hilliard, Rudy Deckers were already to some extent most likely using Muhammad Atta and Marwan al-Shehi for their drug runs, and to see this spy ring down in Florida tailing the hijackers is an indication that they were doing the exact same thing. And once again, changing our understanding of these hijackers to what they really were, which is organized crime and intelligence operatives involved in the drug trade. That sort of betrays exactly what was really going on. And I think that's an important point to stress. A lot of people who research 9/11 truth sort of argue, don't focus on the hijackers. It's all disinformation. It's all just distracting from the true perpetrators. And the thing is, that's almost like saying about the JFK assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald didn't fire a shot at Kennedy, so if you focus on Lee Harvey Oswald, it's a total distraction and you're just trying to hide the truth. But the reality is, when you look at the patsy, when you look at Lee Harvey Oswald, you start to untangle his own intelligence connections, and you start to see people like Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, all these CIA operatives who were involved in setting up Lee Harvey Oswald and also had an involvement in the plot. I mean, if you're going to set up patsies or fall guys in an intelligence operation, you need to have some level of control over them. So if you look at who controls the patsies, then you get a layer of insight into who is behind the plot. And so for that reason, looking at Muhammad Atta and these other, you know, Islamists, these other people from the Hamburg terrorist clique who came to the U.S. supposedly to train for the hijackings, but most likely up to other things instead. When you look at these people and you look at the fact that they're intelligence operatives, it becomes very clear that yeah, if the people behind these hijackers are U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence, they and then these people go on to supposedly commit a hijacking, or maybe they were actually set up to take the fall, then you can make a pretty clear inference of who was actually behind the 9/11 attacks, which is these intelligence organizations. So it's not useless to look at these so-called hijackers and what their connections were. It just means you have to keep a clear head and realize that it's not about the hijackers themselves, it's about the people who the hijackers are working for.
Yes, very much so, George. And of course, the other connections too between the Mossad and 9/11, like our urban moving systems with Dominic Suter, with the five dancing Israelis, and of course, them celebrating and having puzzling behavior after the 9/11 attacks, and of course them disappearing and going back to Israel. And Suter, of course, fled Israel before he could be questioned. And then you have from that too, you have the alleged plot, which the Antidote podcast did very well covering from 9/11 to 11/9 Part 2. And I'll put the link in the show notes about that. The George Washington Bridge plot that was covered and reported both on CBS and CNN. The two suspects were in FBI custody after a truckload of explosives were discovered around the George Washington Bridge. And so, it seems to be that was a failed Israeli plot to destroy the George Washington Bridge on 9/11. And so you have those connections to Israel too as well. Of course, many people have always mentioned the dancing Israelis more than the 9/11 bridge plot, but that's something else. And one other thing I want to mention too is, you ever heard before Freedom Tower, which we have now, did you ever hear about the alleged Twin Towers 2 mock that they were both supposed to build, what they call World Trade Center Phoenix? Did you ever hear about that, George?
No, I personally haven't.
Okay, so those were the mock-ups for the Twin Tower. Again, it was supposed to be almost identical in a lot of ways compared to what we have Freedom Tower now. They were supposed to be kind of rebuilt. I mean, as far as replacing the third, fourth, and fifth World Trade Centers. So they're supposed to be three 12-story buildings, and they're supposed to look identical. They're supposed to be the Twin Towers. So very interesting things about that I just want to mention was that Donald Trump early went to bat for this design and for them to be rebuilt. And so he also talked about Larry Silverstein. Of course, Larry Silverstein being the original owner of the Twin Towers. Good old lucky Larry, who won was it a double indemnity policy for the terrorist attacks for the World Trade Centers themselves, George, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I mean, he was able to sort of say that I think, there were two buildings, so he should be able to get twice the insurance money that he would have otherwise gotten. So, yeah, there was a lot of weird financial maneuvering by him going on. And, of course, he conveniently misses his intended, meeting at the towers and doesn't show up on 9/11. So
Trump became the sponsor of the Twin Towers, too, and said, it's in the hands of a man named Larry Silverstein, who's a friend of mine, who's a great developer in New York and a really good guy. And I hate the design, and I don't think Larry likes the design. It was fostered upon him. It's a 50-story building that looks like 120 stories. It's a skeleton. And that's the last thing that we need in New York is a skeleton representing the World Trade Center. I think it's not appropriate design. I don't like it. But Larry's a good developer. He'll get it built, I think, and it's tough. It depends on the market. So, of course, Trump had... once publicity for it, that was beforehand, but once publicity for the tower started increasing, Trump changed his mind from that and decided to start officially supporting the project. So, good old Trump saying, good old Larry Silverstein, he's a guy, just like he said Jeffrey Epstein was a heck of a guy too, right? Fabulous guy, right, George? Right? And
yeah.
so, there you go. I mean... I guess
Right.
either Trump just says these things and doesn't really believe them, and he's our guy, or he is connected to a lot of these people.
Well, yeah, I would definitely agree that he is, and we'll probably get into some of that other stuff later as well when you get more into Russian connections. But I did want to bring up, since you already talked about the Mossad connections behind, these suspicious activities, driving vans with explosives and so on. There was another very curious case involving the World Trade Center right before 9/11 that kind of escaped notice for the most part, but really once again starts pointing in the direction of Mossad and potentially Russian organized crime as well. And that's this gang of people who were supposedly Arabs but seem to have potentially been Mossad agents working to get fake IDs and also gaining access to the World Trade Center a couple days before the September 11th attacks. And this whole story broke in 2002 or early 2002 when a driver's license examiner in Memphis, Tennessee, named Catherine Smith, was found dead very mysteriously. She was in a car that was ran off the highway, and then the car itself had, been set on fire, and she was, burned beyond belief. And it was ruled pretty much immediately that this fire was not an accident. And then the media kind of gave a disingenuous thing. Well, either she said it herself or she was murdered, as if there was any plausible explanation besides murder. But yeah, this woman mysteriously died, and then it turns out that right before she died, she had been caught up in this investigation where a bunch of people had come from New York. They had driven to from New York to Memphis to try to get fake IDs that they were then going to use for unspecified purposes. And the ringleader of this group was a man named Khaled Odtla, and Khaled Odtla he actually was a native of Jerusalem, and he was living in this very upscale neighborhood in Memphis, so he was apparently very wealthy, and he had contacts with these other people in New York, including someone named Rocky Hamad, who was a young man who supposedly ran this company called Magic Plumbing and Heating in Brooklyn. And so Rocky Hamad was, part of this group that was going up to Memphis to get fake IDs. And then when the Catherine Smith was, revealed as having been bribed to give these fake IDs, she was going to cooperate with the investigation. And then suddenly she turns up dead. As this investigation started to unfold, it turned out that Rocky Hamad had actually been in the World Trade Center on September 5th, 2001, in the basement doing work on the sprinkler system for some reason. And there was pretty much a scramble to deny any responsibility for this. The Port Authority said, yeah, we didn't do this. It must have been a tenant who invited him in. But really, no one would claim responsibility for this. And then it turned out that Rocky Hamad had a signed letter from a man named Sergei Danko, spelled Denko, also known as Sergei Davydenko, who ran a company called Danko Mechanical. And supposedly Sergei Davydenko was giving Rocky Hamad, basically he was the contractor that was getting Rocky Hamad to do work in the World Trade Center, but they never really explained what this work was for, who they were working on the behalf of, and this story kind of just faded out of nowhere, and basically, totally escaped public attention. But the implications of this are kind of stunning when you see that this this person from Jerusalem who is super rich was getting all these young Arabs to go get fake IDs, and one of them was actually working in the World Trade Center for no apparent good reason right before 9/11, and that there was also this odd Russian guy, Sergei Davydenko, who you can find basically no information on, was actually employing him. A lot of this stuff really just starts to form a very disturbing picture of what was going on. And supposedly, this person, there's a forum called Rigorous Intuition that had posted about some of this, and apparently somebody had linked this whole scandal to Russian mafia networks in the New York, New Jersey area involved in drug running and child trafficking, but wouldn't really say much further beyond that, wouldn't exactly explain how they knew this. But what I can say is that Khaled Otla himself was also, he turned out to be a pedophile. He had been he was in Utah. He had raped the 12-year-old sister of his girlfriend, and then he fled down to Florida. So there is this disturbing pedophilia connection as well to this guy who sort of reeks of being a Mossad agent or some kind of Israeli intelligence agent. So this whole thing here, this is just one of those weird little things about 9/11 that almost never gets brought up, but really is just part of this insane backdrop of intelligence operations, organized crime, all these different players meshing up with each other and coming together in the lead up to these attacks.
Yeah, very much so. And it's very interesting how very few people have talked about the so-called brownstone operation when it comes to 9/11. Because I mean, we talked about everything. We talked about the trifecta, right? Well, I guess we didn't talk about gun running, but I would assume that did go on too as well.
Well,
but
yeah.
but we got our weapons running, should I say? But we have we have traffic, and Blackstone brownstone rings connected to 9/11, and then we have drugs connected to 9/11. So where's the trifecta of the intelligence agencies? George, was there any arms dealing going around during this time period? I know I did a little bit of research on what they call Iran Contra 2, and that may turn out to be exactly what was going on at that time, as far as gun running by these people. But did you come across anything with gun running?
Well, yeah. I mean, the honestly, wherever drug trafficking is, armed trafficking is pretty much always there as well. I can say that a couple things. First of all, that the pal of Muhammad Atta, his closest friend in Venice, Florida, Wolfgang Boehringer, he himself was almost certainly involved in the arms trade. He was boasting about it. Like I think he, after his arrest in North Fanning Island in 2005, he sort of bragged, you want arms? I can get you any type of arms you want. So Boehringer is one of the people who was involved in this arms trade. There were also a couple people and interesting people in the lead up to 9/11 who were involved in tracking Stinger missiles that were supposedly going to Al Qaeda, and this actually would form the basis of another connection to a sort of connection to Trump, because there are two curious figures who have come up in the sort of the penetration, so to speak, of Al Qaeda, this Islamist group that's obviously a front for U.S. intelligence and other intelligence. The first person here is kind of well known in 9/11 truth circles. His name is Randy Glass, and Randy Glass was basically a diamond wholesaler, diamond dealer who was accused of defrauding a lot of people in the diamond business. And then after defrauding all these people, he sort of made a deal, and he agreed to become a federal informant working undercover to help track weapons distribution in the Middle East, and specifically Stinger missiles that were going to terrorist groups in the Middle East like Al Qaeda. And so he became a very important figure in supposedly penetrating this group. And at one point he makes the claim that he was in New York City, and he was meeting with some representatives of the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, and one agent of the ISI sort of motioned over to Randy Glass, sort of directed his attention towards the Twin Towers and said, back in 1998 or 1999, those towers are coming down. So again, clear indication of foreknowledge on the part of the ISI, and of course, the ISI is a very important organization on 9/11. They show up in many contexts as being really the CIA conduit to Islamic groups like Al Qaeda. And this history, again, dates back to the Iran-Contra period. And that's why it's important to see the same people in Iran-Contra, they kind of show up here as well, that the CIA basically created this back channel where they would give weapons and give arms to the Pakistani intelligence services, who would then directly funnel them into these mujahideen groups. And the network supposedly dissolved after in the 1980s, after the Afghan-Soviet war was over. But in reality, this network never dissolved, as people like Sibel Edmonds, FBI whistleblower, have talked about, that these networks stayed in place because it was very geopolitically useful to get these terrorists to go around Central Asia to destabilize the region and work for on various U.S. intelligence operations in that respect. So this arms dealing with the Pakistani ISI is a very significant part of what led up to 9/11. And many of the people I mentioned already, Richard Armitage was meeting with the Pakistani intelligence chief, and also on the morning of 9/11, both Porter Goss and Bob Graham were meeting with the Pakistani intelligence chief. So yeah, the involvement of that agency is very interesting with the money and the arms going to these terrorist groups. But another interesting connection pops up with none other than Felix Sater. And Felix Sater is, of course, going to be well known to people who follow the Trump Russia story because I mean Felix Sater was involved in these Trump Soho deals with that of course led to Russian financiers. But the one of the sort
Hold
of
on, hold
hidden
on, hold on, George. Now we know that um, Trump's only connection to Russia was Russia allegedly meddling in the elections. Now that's what mainstream media tells me. That's what Robert Mueller supposedly went after Trump about. And of course, we all know that it led to Trump did not know that Russia meddled in elections. So therefore, he was off. He's fine. Don't worry about it. He's got no connections to Russia whatsoever. So you're telling me that wait, hold on, everything we know is a lie, that Trump, just like the CMP, just like the CFR, Trump, just like Hillary Clinton, they all have connections to Russia. Is that what you're telling me? Is that what you're saying here? That can't
yeah,
be.
I'm
The fourth
afraid I do.
the fourth estate would have
Yeah,
told me.
well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, John, but I'm afraid I do have to tell you that that is the case. And in fact, honestly, the whole thing about Russian election meddling was the greatest distraction that these organized criminals in the US who were doing business with Russia could ever hope for, because it basically took this all these corrupt business dealings that are basically out in the open and reduced it to this shadowy accusation by some intelligence agencies that could easily be brushed off as not true or something they had no knowledge of. And that's one of the things people really don't understand about Russiagate is it's not just the deep state is attacking the president, as Q and people like Alex Jones would have you believe. It's that these two opposing factions are basically pushing equal and opposite narratives of Trump being opposed by the deep state. And after that all fizzles away, you're left with the unresolved connections that Trump had with Russian organized crime and Russian businesses that never really see the light of day. And Felix Sater kind of illustrates that because, of course, Felix Sater was a very important figure behind Trump's business ventures. And it's actually, his importance really can't be, oh, you can't really understate it, that Felix Sater was kind of the person who gave Trump the idea of using his name and basically selling his name to developers who would then actually make the properties, because none of these banks would support Trump's actual personal businesses anymore. So the idea that Felix Sater gave of Trump to just license his name to these other development companies was a very important thing. And in fact, some of the properties that were licensed under Trump's name, such as the a club like a Mar-a-Lago type club in Panama, have been linked to drug trafficking and organized crime. So, yeah, very curious to yeah, the Trump Ocean Club International Hotel and Tower in Panama, that was involved in drug trafficking. So to see Felix Sater basically influencing Trump to put his name on these ventures and then seeing these ventures themselves get involved in organized crime and drug dealing is a very curious thing to note. But yeah, Felix Sater he has an interesting history himself. Felix Sater basically he was formerly this Wall Street guy who was very smart but also hot-headed, and he got into this fight back in 1991 that led to a man getting injured in a bar brawl, and so he pretty much lost his official ability to work on Wall Street, and so instead Felix Sater started this business venture that involved the New York City mafia, that was basically a stock pump and dump scheme. And while he was doing this work, he was supposedly approached by a U.S. defense contractor who recruited him to work for U.S. intelligence because Felix Sater had excellent connections with Russian businessmen and, by virtue of that, Russian intelligence operatives already. So Felix Sater basically started working as a spy for U.S. intelligence. And one of Felix Sater's very first operations was to track down a lot of Stinger missiles that were originally given to the Mujahideen by the CIA, just given to them, and then the agency supposedly wanted to round them up and stop these terrorists from using them. And so Felix Sater went on this mission to track down these Stinger missiles, and he was able to find them and basically gave them to his lawyer, who was a CIA contact, and proved that he'd gotten them. Felix Sater was also involved in some other interesting missions. He was trying to find evidence that that diamonds were being basically the sale of diamonds, these diamond businesses that were being used to launder money for Al Qaeda, and he apparently like found a dealer who could get him to Afghanistan and use that as a springboard for his own spy work. And it's interesting to note that because Felix Sater and Randy Glass were both involved in the diamond business, were both involved with Stinger missiles going to Al Qaeda. They were both operating in New York during the same exact time frame. And so a lot of people haven't really brought up this connection, but I really do wonder if Felix Sater and Randy Glass actually ran in the same circles or maybe even knew each other because they were doing pretty much identical work at the same time. But yeah, Felix Sater later on he made contacts with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, and that enabled him to get the phone numbers of Osama bin Laden, which were then passed on to the U.S. intelligence community. And so yeah, Felix Sater was a big player in penetrating Al Qaeda, and the reason that that's important, even though it may not seem that way at first glance, is that Al Qaeda to whatever extent that's a real organization. Obviously, it's a bit murky. These Islamic groups that are being funded by the CIA, being given weapons and money and logistical support. All these groups, they're assets, but they're also assets that aren't, perfectly controllable. And so, if you want to be able to steer these Islamist groups in the right direction to do the operations that you want, to commit these destabilization operations where they're strategically useful in places like Central Asia, but also want to make sure that they're not actually threatening you and committing terrorist attacks that you didn't want, you have to have a substantial level of penetration in these organizations. A lot of human intelligence, which would mean people who were inserted into these organizations, and some excellent examples of likely Al Qaeda operatives who were, human intelligence working for U.S. and similar intelligence services. Mohammed Atta is almost a perfect example. He's a CIA guy, maybe Mossad guy as well, possibly even linked to German intelligence because Mohammed Atta came over from Germany, and he was actually on this fellowship named after an I.G. Farben businessman that enabled him to go to the U.S. in the first place. And this fellowship, by the way, was funded by Alpha Bank out of Russia, which is another odd connection. But yeah, Mohammed Atta is one of the clearest examples of a U.S. sort of double agent who was able to get up to high levels of the Al Qaeda organization and basically steer it in the right direction, whatever this plot when it was taking form. There's also the supposed mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who
Hey, then, George,
was
hold
in.
on. Let me ask you something. Um, did you ever come across, when we're talking about the diamond mines and the Russian oligarchs, did you ever come across Glencore, the company Glencore? Of course, Glencore was originally had started by good old Mark Rich. Of course, you should be well aware who Mark Rich is, right?
Yeah, and
Okay.
Mark Rich does sort of show up in some of these other things that I'll talk about later with the looting of the Russian treasury with a lot of with by the Bush and Clinton administrations and how that ties into the Russian mob. But yeah, I haven't come up with Glencore being directly involved with any of this, but there probably is a connection if you dig far
Yeah,
enough.
because Glencore is like a commodity traders company, and so when you look into Glencore, of course, Mark Rich and everything, it leads you to who Mark Rich trained, which is a Jewish Israeli businessman by the name of Dan Gertler. Of course, now Dan Gertler was some of the QAnon, the disciples of QAnon there will say, well, Trump issued this executive order against people who are breaking human rights. It was executive order 1388, 1381, 13818. So it blocked Gertler's being able to access his assets under United States jurisdiction because of the global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. So Gertler, of course, has connections to all the diamond mine and copper interests in the Congo that was going through Glencore. Well, the interesting thing about all that is guess who recently has lobbied in the behalf for Gertler? Because Gertler and Glencore kind of are with this kind of left-leaning Deripaska. What's Naomi Campbell's Russian oligarch boyfriend? They gave her the Eye of Horus house. Um, I'll think about it in a minute. Well, they kind of represent this left-leaning Russian oligarchs. It's kind of like a left-leaning, right-leaning battle, kind of mafia ties going on. So guess who
Yeah.
came? Guess who came to lobby on the behalf of Dan Gertler?
Who is it?
Good old Alan Morton Dershowitz, and
Oh,
also
wow.
ex FBI Director Louis Freeh are both trying to
Hmm.
get Trump to allow Gertler to have access to his funds. That he's done nothing wrong as far as civil rights, as far as diamond mining in the Congo, through Glencore or anything like that. He's good, so don't worry about that. So again, when you see all these connections between Russia and the different sides of who's playing who. Oh, it's Vladislav Doronin. Vladislav Doronin is who's a big part of Epstein and a big part of Naomi Campbell, and I think it was actually pulling the streams above Epstein, both him and Lex
Yeah.
Wexner. Um, but yeah, so that's one interest that I haven't heard many people talked about that I've been doing some research for Josh Reeves. And have brought it to his attention is the whole Glencore diamond. You can also do a search about Ivanka Trump's ex-business partner, Moshe Lax, who was also involved in diamond training, like a jeweler as well. It has connections to Glencore and connections to Dan Gertler too. So diamonds also seem to be a major thing for the Russian mob too as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and it's almost certainly an area worthy of more research. And there were some early reports back in like 2001, 2002, I believe, that Al Qaeda was using basically this diamond mining money. I think it was called like diamond blood money for their financing. And there was a specific company called Oryx, Oryx, that was implicated in this scheme. But then supposedly this was all a misunderstanding, and Oryx won a huge lawsuit against the BBC, and they had to back down from that. I'm not total. I'm personally a bit suspicious that this may have actually been a real connection, and part of the reason I am is because none other than Wally Hilliard, the same person we talked about, who has these deep political connections, these apparent CIA connections, and of course, Russian mob connections as well. Wally Hilliard was involved in he ran a business called it was also called Oryx. It was Oryx LLC, and he wouldn't really say what this business was for. He also alluded to having some partners elsewhere, potentially overseas, but wouldn't say who they were. So he just has a very mysterious role with this company and wouldn't even say why he called the company Oryx. So that's still a mystery to be worked out, but I do think that the fact that diamonds show up in so many places, potentially with Wally Hilliard, but definitely with Randy Glass and Felix Sater, makes it an area worthy of digging a lot further. But yeah, I mean, what I was saying about Sater is that he was just part of this whole big operation by U.S. intelligence, and Randy Glass most likely was as well, to penetrate this organization of Islamists at very high levels to insert human intelligence assets, people like Muhammad Atta, who could control what was going on in the organization to a point. Also, signals intelligence, making sure that you had people things like bin Laden's phone number so you could crack it and monitor the communications. And the evidence is very clear and abundant. And I think Mike Rupert's book, Crossing the Rubicon, has one of the best summaries of all this stuff. That there, in a chapter that's called Penetration, there were so many ways that U.S. intelligence and other foreign intelligence services knew exactly what Al Qaeda was doing, exactly what was going on in advance of this terrorist attack, and they knew that it was coming. There were so many warnings being given, very clear and specific warnings of what was going to happen, when it was going to happen, and the Bush administration had to revise their story so many times, saying, yeah, we could never have foreseen an attack like this, and then, oh, yeah, they told us about this, but it wasn't specific enough, but, oh, it was specific in how it would happen, but they didn't say the date, and then they sort of just brushed it off entirely. But the reality is that this organization of Islamists that was working for the CIA and these other intelligence services was so penetrated by the CIA, by Mossad, by Russian intelligence most likely, and probably other agencies like MI6. There was such a degree of penetration that we had basically controlled and knew exactly what they were doing. They couldn't have launched an attack that took us by surprise. That whatever they were planning, and there's evidence that there were a lot more terrorist attacks planned besides just the four plane hijackings that worked. There were many hijackings did that almost happened but were sort of averted, and this sort of shows that the organization was so completely controlled by these intelligence services that we could pick and choose which terrorist attacks succeeded and which ones failed. And Felix Sater shows up as one of the crucial people in making sure that that happened. So he basically did the bidding of however small the part was. He essentially helped the CIA make sure that these attacks happen exactly as they wanted them to. And of course, Felix Sater, you can't sleep on his connections. He was the managing director of the BayRock Group, which was developing Trump's properties like the Trump Soho. And one of his business partners in BayRock was Tevfik Arif. And Tevfik Arif himself shows up in a pedophile scandal in Turkey, where this yacht was basically sort of invaded by Turkish authorities, who found that Tevfik Arif was hosting these sex parties with underage girls who were imported from Russia and Ukraine to service these elite businessmen out of Turkey. So Tevfik Arif was involved in a pedophile ring that is very, very similar to what people like Epstein were up to, and this was around 2009 or so. And then supposedly he was let off eventually. All these charges were dismissed against him, and he basically claimed his innocence. But there were very credible government reports that were released back in 2009 indicating that Tevfik Arif was guilty, and that there were also some other Russian Jewish oligarchs like Alexander Moshkovich who were involved in it too. So again, this is the environment that Felix Sater ran in, with Russian Jewish oligarchs and the mafia and U.S. intelligence, and it all intersects in exactly the same way that it intersects with Muhammad Atta or any of these other people who you look at in 9/11.
Yeah, I agree, George. When you look at the Russian oligarchs, you have the primary Russian faction of origin, you have the Russian Jewish faction of origin, and you have the Mountain Jew Russian faction of origin, like Gavril Abramovich. So, again, it's the whole left and right divide. Those mob bosses fall under that category to some degree. Not saying that they don't have their own, world order plan too as well that they're fighting for, and you can see that now currently with everybody in the mainstream alternative media. Yes, the mainstream alternative media, I'm going to call it that, will tell you that the wars in the Middle East are due to Israel or due to Zionism, and I'm not going to say that doesn't play a role in it. I would also raise the counter fact of them trying to do MIGA, make Iran great again, make Iran Persia again. The Mountain Jews want to displace the Arabs in Iran and take over Persia, and might be one of the biggest reasons why the Council for National Policy has been involved since 9/11 in the Middle East wars since then. Why would the CMP, who parades itself and its many members as being good, strong Christians, why would they want to, retake these Muslim holy lands in the fact that they're stealing all their artifacts and the Mesopotamian artifacts that Josh Reeves has mentioned, and they're bringing them back to America? Why would they have any need for any of those things? So when you see CMP, you don't think Christian values. You look exactly what they tell you, Judeo-Christian values, and that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, and even then, I mean, the whole idea of Christian values with the CNP is kind of a sham. People we've talked about before, like Jerry Falwell and Wally Hilliard, all claim that they're good Christians, and they sort of play it up to a unbelievable extent, but then you see that they're involved in decidedly unchristian activities like organized crime involvement, and with Wally Hilliard abusing his stepdaughter and going out with women far too young for him in a very predatory sense. So the whole thing about CNP representing Christian values is that's just the front that they use to mask what they're really doing, which is all about, continue basically the same sort of agenda of enriching themselves and essentially asserting this Anglo-Zio-American dominance over the rest of the world.
Yes, very much so. Okay, what part of the grand? And we're probably not going to get into all of it tonight. There's no way we're going to be able to, because this is an octopus, is it not, George? The never-ending octopus that encompasses multi-decades and generations. It's all a continuance of it, is it not?
Yeah, it's not even easy to talk about it, because as soon as you get on one thread, you're basically being led to every other one as well. But I think that we would be remiss if we didn't discuss the the brownstone operations, the blackmail networks that really led up to these attacks, because that's one of the rarest things that ever gets mentioned
Yes,
with
yes.
9/11.
Let's definitely cover that. I know you've been doing a lot of research on it. I'm gonna be able to talk about a few things as far as the Council for National Policy's involvement on. I'm pretty sure we're gonna get to one lobbyist, Jack Abramoff. Are we not? So
Yeah, most
yes,
likely.
so yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and let's hit it. Let's hit a part about something that many people, if not anybody outside of me and you, are gonna know about. Let's do it.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, I think the work that I'm about to talk about is really owed to what Jonathan Elenoff did. And Jonathan Elenoff made the documentary series Core of Corruption, where he focused on many of the same issues with foreign intelligence services that we've already talked about before. But Jonathan Elenoff was working on a sort of a sequel to his documentary called Echoes of Treason, and what he ended up stumbling into almost by accident was so devastating and really threatened his life to such an extent that he had to quit his entire investigation and totally left the 9/11 truth field entirely. And it begins, I would say, with an interesting guy named Delmart Vreeland. And Delmart Vreeland, in advance of the 9/11 attacks, he made a warning to the basically he was arrested in 2000 in Canada after coming back from Russia. He claimed that he was an intelligence officer for the US, a naval intelligence officer. He was arrested on, I believe, fraud charges, and while he was in jail in Canada, he made a note where he basically predicted 9/11, and he sort of was, he scrawled all these targets, these potential targets like the World Trade Center, the Sears Tower, a lot of other things on his note that became interesting. And then he said on his note, "Let one happen, stop the rest." And he wrote this note in August of 2001. He sealed the note. Then he got rid of all his contraband pens that he could have used to write the note. And then right after the 9/11 attacks occurred a month later, his jailers pulled the note out of storage and were like, wow, this guy basically predicted the attacks right before they were going to happen. And apparently Vreeland was also warning his mother right before the attacks not to fly. So there's a lot of spin about Vreeland, a lot of efforts to discredit him and say that he wasn't really, aware of this stuff. But if you look at Delmart Vreeland's background, it becomes clear that he is a naval intelligence officer. He did know about these attacks, and he also has a lot of other stuff in his background that, while initially making him seem non-credible, actually connects him to this very familiar Franklin scandal type of pedophile milieu that we're all very familiar with. So Delmart Vreeland, he grew up in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, in the Detroit area. And I should note that this was the same place and same time where the North Fox Island pedophile ring was operating, involving people like Francis Sheldon, Dyer Grossman, Gerald Richards, all these creepy pedophiles who were, flying children to an island, to a supposed nature camp, and then abusing them and making child pornography of them, and also during the same time period of the Oakland County child killer, which overlap with this group. So there was a lot of pedophile activity going on in the same time and place where Vreeland was growing up. He he was also apparently childhood friends with a relative of a Detroit mafia person, so that's interesting. But basically, yeah, Vreeland got involved with doing some work for the bureau with the ATF from a young age, and then eventually he ended up going into the U.S. Navy, and that's where the records of him get really sketchy because supposedly Vreeland he only served in the Navy, like he entered in 1985 or 1986, only served for a few months, and then he got kicked out because he was refusing to do push-ups. But the reality is, if Vreeland actually, he queried his records during his court case in Canada, he actually literally called up the Pentagon Records Center. He queried his records, and his rank was reported as lieutenant. And there's no way that you could become a lieutenant if you were only in the Navy for like a couple months and then got kicked out. So a lot of his records were basically totally vacuumed. The reality is that he served in the Navy for a long, long time, and he was most likely a U.S. naval intelligence operative, as he claimed. And so Vreeland goes on this mission, this odd, unexplained mission to Russia, and then he comes back and he gets arrested, and he has foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks, which he's warning people about. And his note is interesting for a couple of reasons. It says, "Let one happen, stop the rest," which sort of alludes to what I was talking about earlier, which is the idea that the Al-Qaeda organization is so deeply penetrated by U.S. intelligence that they could they knew exactly what attacks were being attempted. They could pick and choose the ones that they wanted to happen, and then they could stop the other ones. And there are actually a lot of little known news stories that came out right after the 9/11 attacks talking about how all of these different terrorist plots nearly happened. Like there were planes with, box cutters being found on them, and storage compartments. There were planes where where these Arab men were like getting mad and becoming belligerent, but the plane didn't take off, so nothing happened. One of the most interesting things was a Time story on September 22nd, 2001, and where there were knife-like weapons found on two different airplanes, and then there were also weapons found on another plane owned by a different airline. And it was actually basically just said outright that U.S. officials believed that there was a quote inside job to get these weapons on the planes in the first place, and they were suspecting that, maybe uh, these airport security corporations were somehow complicit in getting them onto the planes in the first place. And I'll note that these airport security corporations, a lot of them were Israeli owned. Like I think ITCS was one of them, and they were Israeli owned and believed to be an intelligence front. Also, a private U.S. corporation called SAIC was involved in a lot of this airport security stuff, and they showed up in advance of 9/11 in many suspicious roles as well, which we may or may not get to. But yeah, there was a lot of cases where these weapons were found on these planes, or these apparent would-be hijackers were on these planes, but none of these hijacking succeeded. The only ones that succeeded were the four that happened on 9/11. So it appears that Delmar Vreeland was almost certainly right in his claim that there were many, many targets planned, but only some of them actually went through. And apparently, and even Muhammad Atta, apparently, according to some accounts, played a role in steering some of these, in basically quashing some of these hijacking plans. And there were initially plans to try and hit the White House, but Muhammad Atta gave an unconvincing reason for why they shouldn't target the White House, and so they never did target the White House. So interesting that Atta basically made sure that there was no danger to Cheney or the others on 9/11. But yeah, I digress. That's just one of the things about Vreeland that sort of reinforces his credibility, that he really did know what he was talking about. Another thing about Vreeland that's very interesting is that Delmar Vreeland makes mention of a Russian oligarch named Chalva Chigrinsky. And Chalva Chigrinsky, he ran a Russian oil company that was involved in exploring a bunch of Russian oil fields, and he himself, he did business with BP. He also did business with Gazprom, which is sort of the Russian natural gas company that's like the Russian version of Enron. He also signed it. He was also involved in a business venture with Dick Cheney's company Halliburton in 2002. So it's curious that Vreeland was aware of this Russian oligarch, and he was making note of him. And Vreeland even claimed that his mission in Russia involved breaking into the apartment of Chalva Chudzinski. So whatever he was up to in Russia that led to him coming back with knowledge of 9/11 had something to do with this Russian oil oligarch. So that's another thing that's curious about Vreeland. But the most significant thing about Delmar Vreeland when it comes to these brownstone operations is that Delmar Vreeland was a pedophile. And this is one of those things that was brought up to discredit Vreeland, but it actually really shows that Vreeland was part and parcel of this intelligence circle that overlaps with pedophilia. That cases like the Franklin scandal make very clear. And a couple things, Vreeland, when he was being interviewed by journalists like Sandra Hicks, he had someone named Joey who was like 17 years old and was supposedly Vreeland's son. But Sandra Hicks noticed that Vreeland was way too physical with Joey than you would expect of a normal father-son relationship. He basically let Joey smoke and drink with no reservations. They seemed a lot more, should I say, comfortable and enmeshed with each other than you would expect with a father and son relationship. There was just something about it that was off. And considering that Vreeland was like 34 years old, the idea that he would have a 17-year-old son at that age was very unconvincing to a lot of people, and the suspicions that Joey was not actually Vreeland's son. It was actually a child that Vreeland was molesting. And this was sort of confirmed eventually because after Vreeland eventually got out of jail, went back to the U.S., he he was wanted on various charges in Colorado, and specifically he was wanted on drug distribution and child molestation charges, like child prostitution. And it was claimed that he would basically lure these kids in with drugs, and then he would, get them drunk, get them high, and then he would molest them and make child pornography of them. So Vreeland was clearly a pedophile and a sex criminal in Colorado, and he was arrested and he was given a very high sentence, 336 years in prison. So Vreeland is never getting out of jail now. He did his job as an intelligence operative, and now he's been put up on these charges and sort of thrown away. But the interesting thing about it is that shortly before Vreeland got arrested, he was alluding to some people in the 9/11 truth community, people like Andy Stevenson and Jeff Wells, about about how he had a history of abuse that was very, very similar to what happened in the Franklin scandal. Like he was sort of alluding to his own history being like those kids who were victims of Franklin. And so to see, his background in Grosse Pointe when North Fox Island was going on is significant for that reason. The fact that he's in Colorado and being involved in this child prostitution arrest, in, far from making him a non-credible witness, it really validates the idea that he was part of this network in the first place. But in any case, Vreeland was arrested and put away, and so eventually Jonathan Elenoff, when he was making his Echoes of Treason documentary, he decided that he would go to Colorado and he would actually investigate Vreeland. So when Jonathan Elenoff went to Colorado and he investigated Delmart Vreeland, he was subject to some assassination attempts that he's talked about. He apparently, someone tried to like run into his car at full speed at a stop sign, and he nearly got injured because of that. So as soon as he went to Colorado and started trying to dig into this stuff, he was put in mortal danger, basically. But then something else started to happen, which was that he also was working for a radio producer in Denver named Tom Martino. And as he was working for Tom Martino, he got pulled into what he initially thought was a completely unrelated scandal. And there were a lot of young men coming forward saying that they had been molested at a young age, sometimes even when they were underage, by the former sheriff of Arapahoe County. The former Arapahoe County sheriff was named Pat Sullivan, who was a legendary figure in law enforcement. Pat Sullivan had personal friendships with George Bush Sr., that is. He was appointed to various crime commissions by Bill Clinton. He was involved in all sorts of major cases like the Columbine school shooting, where he would infamously claim at one point that he believed there was no conspiracy, even though his deputies were giving blatantly contradictory information about what happened in Columbine. So, Pat Sullivan was a very interesting guy, and Jonathan Elenoff would later even dig out the fact that Pat Sullivan, he basically did work at the Bay of Pigs, so presumably worked for the CIA, that he was a demolition expert, an explosives expert. And another, lesser known thing about Pat Sullivan is that he helped prevent an assassination attempt on George Bush Sr. in Colorado in 1992 that is pretty much never reported on. There was this woman who, if memory serves, goes by the name Deborah Butler, and yeah, Deborah Butler seemed like a fairly normal person. She was, I believe, a legal secretary or something, and she was in Colorado, and she supposedly came up with the idea that she wanted to kill George Bush. So she got a gun. She basically waited out along the route where George Bush was going to, where his motorcade was going to go by, and she almost shot him. But then supposedly there was a man who went up and approached her and caused her to miss her target. And Pat Sullivan had noticed. Pat Sullivan was part of George Bush's security detail in Colorado, and he noticed it. And then he told a deputy to stay behind, basically stay between this woman and George Bush, and make sure that he wouldn't get shot. So that was just one of those weird stories about George Bush and this assassination attempt that almost never gets made public, but is very interesting. And there's more on CABDA for people who want to see it. But anyway, yeah, Pat Sullivan was this legendary law enforcement figure, and this drug war crusader who is being accused by all these people of being a meth user and a pedophile, or a sex abuser who's giving these people meth and basically, getting them into this vulnerable state, and then after they get high, having sex with them. And that includes underage people as well. So Jonathan Elenoff got involved in this, investigating this. He interviewed people, he tracked down witnesses, and eventually Jonathan Elenoff sort of got pulled into working with the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI to do this undercover investigation. And he investigated Pat Sullivan for a while, and then in November of 2011, the story finally broke publicly that Pat Sullivan was caught in a sting operation trading meth for sex, that he had been busted, and he was interrogated by his own deputies who he had formerly trained and supervised, and arrested in the jail that was named after him, ironically enough. And so Pat Sullivan was asked various questions. At one point, he was asked if he ever did anything with underage boys, and he sort of admitted to it, but in a very vague way. So Pat Sullivan, he was put away. He was indicted on various charges such as meth distribution and also soliciting a prostitute and trying to corrupt a public figure. Then he got a very, very lenient sentence where a bunch of these charges were dropped, such as corrupting a public official. He was basically given, only a couple weeks in jail and then put on probation for a while. So the whole story with Pat Sullivan was already disturbing enough, but when Jonathan Elenoff dug further, there's a lot more about Pat Sullivan that started to come out. That Pat Sullivan was not a lone offender, not a lone nut, that he was really overseeing a massive, massive uh, pedophile network in Colorado who was operating for the purpose of blackmailing people. And some of the indications that that was what was going on. The fact that Pat Sullivan, after he retired as Arapahoe County Sheriff in 2007 or so, he ended up getting work as the security director of the Cherry Creek School District in the Littleton, Arapahoe area. And as the security director of Cherry Creek, he ended up appointing as a security guard a man named Sean Moss. Now, Sean Moss had no qualifications for this job. Sean Moss was an adult film star, and he worked at a gay bathhouse called the Triple C. But he was just like let through and put as a security guard because everyone trusted Pat Sullivan. So Sean Moss was put into this school as security guard, and he was apparently luring these kids from the school to meth and sex parties. So basically recruiting them into this pedophile network, essentially. And so Sean Moss was found out. He was quietly fired by the school. They didn't really say why. And then Pat Sullivan left soon after, supposedly unrelated. And then Sean Moss, he gets put into jail on domestic violence charges. He is bailed out of jail by Pat Sullivan, and then shortly thereafter, Pat Sullivan meets with Sean Moss on the night before Sean Moss dies, and then Sean Moss is found dead in the South Platte River with a date rape drug in his system. So Sullivan is almost certainly, a person of interest. I would call him a very likely murderer of this person, Sean Moss, who was basically being used as a recruiter into this pedophile ring. So that's just one of the disturbing things. Pat Sullivan's babysitter from 20 years back, her name was Denise Davenport, was also found dead in this exact same river many years earlier. So, two people who Pat Sullivan knows getting found dead in the same river in the same circumstances is very odd. But yeah, basically Pat Sullivan was, according to all these witnesses that Jonathan Elenoff found, was was running a pedophile network where these law enforcement officers were the primary procurers, getting kids into these rings, essentially trafficking them around and also providing them to high-level government and business people for the purpose of blackmail. And there was a lot of other news stories that were breaking around the same time. That Pat Sullivan was arrested, the Denver police chief ended up leaving, and a new police chief was sworn in. There were sheriff's deputies who were driving around trying to lure people for sex. There were these investigations into bathhouses like the Triple C and meth dealers and whether they were involved in these rings. Basically, yeah, there was a lot of sort of a cleanup operation, basically, where all these other pedophile rings and meth rings were being busted in Colorado, and basically all at the same time as the Pat Sullivan case. So the story never really reached public attention, but Jonathan Elenoff found that there was this massive, massive pedophile network that went on, that Pat Sullivan was supervising and was using to provide these children for purposes of blackmail. And considering Pat Sullivan's well-connected political background and, as Elenoff found with the Bay of Pigs, likely CIA background as well, Pat Sullivan was basically, it would appear, a high-level intelligence operative who was supervising a big pedophile operation that was being used to blackmail people for 9/11. And the people who were involved in this blackmail scheme were said to be high-level government and high-level military people. And that is also a bit interesting when you look at these scandals in the Pentagon in around 2006 or so that were kind of a big deal for a time, but then were totally ignored. All these big scandals about child pornography use on the Pentagon networks. You remember that, John?
Yes, I do, George, and how they were completely, just brushed under the rug like mostly everything else is. You know what I mean? Oh, don't worry.
Yeah,
Well, just a few bad actors. We'll take care of them. Nothing to see here. Move along.
right. And so when Jonathan Elnoff claims that Pat Sullivan was getting all these military people and blackmailing them into compliance in advance of the 9/11 op, that really just makes you wonder if there was a culture that was being deliberately engineered within the Pentagon to make sure that it was, full of pedophiles who could then be blackmailed to do exactly what these high-level power players wanted. So that's just one of the big brownstone operations that was being run on 9/11. It has some tenuous links to, the Columbine case, which we might talk about later because that ties into the flight schools. But basically, yeah, there was this gigantic pedophile network that was never exposed, unfortunately, but was clearly much bigger than it was made out to be by the mainstream media. And actually, there's a Russian mafia connection as well that we can talk about if you want to get into that too, because that actually links back to the crowd that Muhammad Atta ran with as well.
What about Jack Abramoff and all this, real quick?
Yeah, I mean, Abramoff is an interesting guy for a couple reasons. He ran this casino boat organization called Sun Cruise that was pretty much taken over in a mafia hit. There was a businessman named Gus Bolas who got into this business venture with Abramoff and some of his associates, and then he started getting upset, and then eventually he got gunned down in what it was a blatant mob style execution. And then Abramoff and his cronies took over the company, and Sun Cruise was involved in some corrupt dealings. Abramoff was lobbying people like Bob Ney for favorable treatment. Bob Ney, the former House Administration Services chairman, who also shows up in some election fraud scandals. But yeah, the Sun Cruise casino boats are interesting for a particular reason because the FBI was investigating the likelihood that several 9/11 hijackers had, in fact, gone on a Sun Cruise boat shortly before the attacks. And Muhammad Atta was very likely one of these people who did. The Sun Cruise casino boats had a big center in Hollywood, Florida. That was one of the biggest places where they docked, and that was where the hijackers were staying. So there's a likely connection between Abramoff and these casino boats. But, Abramoff himself, as I've said before, he on previous streams parallels Jeffrey Epstein in a lot of ways. That Abramoff is, he was involved in this venture on the Northern Marianas Islands where he totally destroyed labor protections on the Marianas Islands, made sure that the U.S. didn't regulate them at all on behalf of the sweatshop industry that pretty much controlled the Marianas Islands government. And the result of that was a tragedy. It was led to these children being forced into labor at these sweatshops. Girls were being forced into prostitution, forced to have abortions. They basically created an epidemic of slavery, and particularly sex slavery on the Marianas Islands. And so that makes it kind of odd that Abramoff was also flying his clients, like Majority Leader Tom DeLay, to the Marianas Islands as lobbying, as a lobbying thing, like as a carrot, as a way to get them on his side. And it makes you wonder what exactly he was doing on the Marianas Islands. Was it just an innocent trip, or was Abramoff actually having his clients partake with these child prostitutes who he helped create in the first place? It's just nothing's been proven at this point, but it's a uh, very curious thing for him to do, I would say. And there's still a lot with the Marianas Islands and Abramoff that has yet to be explored, and also other alleged pedophile rings in D.C. that Abramoff may have been connected to. I think that, yeah, Abramoff fits the profile of another intelligence operative, likely CIA and Mossad, who was a handler for some of the hijackers for a time and also was involved in these brownstone rings.
You and I, George, will do a show eventually on Abramoff, and I think Josh is going to cover him, hopefully in The Secret Right, Volume
Yeah,
3. But you and I will
right.
definitely do a show in the next couple of months about Abramoff specifically. I guess go a few things about the Mariana Islands. Like you mentioned, Abramoff he took the Northern Mariana Islands on as a lobbying client. It was paid at least $7 million by the CNMI government from 1995 to 2001. So he, like you said, he was labor the sweatshots down there, and labor for reducing of labor laws in that general area. And so it was Council for National Policy member Tom DeLay, who Abramoff had helped craft policy to extend exemptions for the federal immigration and minimum wage labor laws to Saipan Industries that was working in the U.S. Commonwealth of Mariana Islands. And also, it's alleged that factories on Saipan had forced their workers to have abortions in order to keep their jobs. So, in addition to that, Abramoff's lobbying team helped Representative Council for National Policy member Ralph Hall from Texas, who many people who follow Josh Reeves' work knows that Ralph Hall did a lot as far as trying to make sure that no one had access to the rock wall and also had property around the rock wall as well. He attacked the credibility of Katrina, a teenage sex slave who federal officials relocated to Hawaii, and testified to federal investigators in Congress about the sex trade on that island in the process of forestalling a federal government criminal prosecution. So, Ralph Hall pretty much was the one who went on when she testified to Congress, went on the attack on her to try to, bury that there was no sex scandal going on there. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the CMP is, this is a Council for National Policy, much like the Franklin scandal. This is a big CMP, sex trafficking, child molestation, slave labor ring that is still going on to this day. There was a recent article that came out that the sweatshops are now gone from the Northern Mariana Islands, but now it's been replaced by casinos, which are being run by, or not run, but as far as like lobbying firms and stuff being run by the general area. One being Corey Lewandowski, former Trump's campaign manager, is now lobbying for the casinos in that area and the money laundering that's occurring supposedly at those casinos and everything. So it seems like it's still CMP power plays going on in Mariana Islands. Mariana Islands are controlled by the Council for National Policy, and now it seems to be moved, you could say, from Abramoff and Tom DeLay to Corey Lewandowski.
Yeah, I would say so. And it's also very interesting that, one of Abramoff's business partners, Patrick Pizzella, who was involved in these lobbying schemes with the Marianas Islands, was later put in as deputy labor secretary, with Alex Acosta, of course, being the labor secretary. And Alex Acosta, besides covering up Epstein's crimes, was also believed to have covered up some of Abramoff's crimes because he was also the prosecutor on that case as well.
Yeah, very much so. Is there anything else that you want to finish up and cover? About 12
Yeah,
more minutes or so, and then we'll
yeah,
do another episode covering everything, because Lord knows we're not gonna
yeah,
be able to get all tonight.
right. Yeah, I think the big one that I want to get into is just the rest of the Russian mob connection to Pat Sullivan's ring, and also how that links to Jeffrey Epstein, because I think that's one of the least known things about any of this. And basically, the one of the things that Elenoff dug up is that this human trafficking ring was not just, a totally U.S. centric thing, although it was obviously very much involved with people like Pat Sullivan, who were CIA operatives, and with Colorado law enforcement officials. It was also involved with the Russian mafia, and specifically a figure from the Russian mafia named Victor Koziny. Uh, and Victor Koziny is interesting for a number of reasons, but one of the most interesting reasons is that Victor Koziny is actually a direct connection to the same crowd that Muhammad Atta was involved in. Specifically, as I've talked about before, Muhammad Atta's best friend in while he was in Venice, Florida, was a German pilot named Wolfgang Boehringer. And Boehringer, of course, said that he worked for the CIA doing presumably on drug running and arms running, which is most likely accurate. But another thing that Wolfgang Boehringer claimed is that he was the personal pilot of Victor Cosini. And Victor Cosini has one of the most interesting backgrounds in a lot of these players, and he also sort of reeks of intelligence involvement, U.S. intelligence involvement. Basically, Victor Cosini has been involved in a number of these privatization schemes in the former Soviet Union and in both the Czech Republic and then in Azerbaijan. So Victor Cosini, he was formerly from the Czech Republic. His family ended up escaping and moving to Germany. And supposedly Victor Cosini, he, as an 18-year-old boy, I guess, living in Germany, he was able to supposedly con a U.S. physics professor named Marlon Scully. And by the way, Marlon Scully had been working on the Strategic Defense Initiative under the Reagan administration, the famous Star Wars program. But basically, he was supposedly able to convince Marlon Scully that he was a physics prodigy, even though he had literally no knowledge of physics. But the official explanation is that Marlon Scully didn't realize this until later. I'm skeptical of that. But he was able to get Marlon Scully to bring him back to the U.S. and study with him at the University of New Mexico. And then after that, Victor Cusini supposedly hooks up with basically a couple that was living with like an American couple, and then he supposedly steals this man's wife from him, and then marries her for a time, and she totally bankrolls his education at Harvard University, which takes like 6 years to complete. But he eventually does. He gets a degree in economics in like 1989, and he actually gets a glowing recommendation from uh, Stephen Breyer, who would later become a Supreme Court justice. So it's interesting that this young kid who sort of is being viewed as a con man is able to get a recommendation from none other than a Harvard professor and future Supreme Court justice like Breyer. So anyway, after that, Victor Cosini goes on to work at various financial firms and hedge funds in Britain, despite having no real qualifications for any of this stuff. Now, does that sound familiar? Going right out of school and then going on to work for all these hedge funds and having no real explanation of how he got there in the first place? Does that remind you of a certain figure in the news recently who allegedly killed himself?
Oh, you mean Jeffrey Epstein, where we have no idea really about his past? Oh, no, no. George, tell me more.
Yeah, I mean, Cosini's just very interesting in that regard because just like Epstein, he's basically cons his way through this educational process and then supposedly gets onto all of these financial firms despite having no actual qualifications. And then ultimately, Cosini ends up deciding to get involved with the former Soviet Union and trying to privatize some of their industries. And just to give a bit of background on that, because there are some very curious figures who show up in that whole thing. There's evidence that a lot of this whole privatization scheme and the emergence of the Russian oligarchs and the Russian mafia was deliberately engineered by the Bush administration and the Clinton administration after that. First of all, you have this intelligence figure named Leo Wanta who claims that to have been Reagan's junkyard dog in his words, and that he was apparently being given the mission by the Bush administration to destabilize the Russian ruble and basically help crash their economy to collapse the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of questions over his story, but there's some evidence that indeed he really was an international businessman and an ambassador like he claims. So you have Leo Wanta trying to destabilize the Russian economy at the behest of the Bush administration. Then you have actually none other than Robert Maxwell, the infamous Mossad spy who also enjoys good relations with MI6, US intelligence, and the KGB. And Robert Maxwell, apparently at the behest of the Bush administration as well, gets a lot of these KGB operatives on his side to do a coup against Gorbachev, a coup that was wanted by the Bush administration in the first place. So Robert Maxwell, who has a foot in both worlds of the intelligence service, is able to get all these KGB operatives to do this coup to officially collapse the Soviet Union. And then after that, a bunch of these KGB operatives are basically involved in the scheme to privatize various industries in the former Soviet Union and essentially working hand in hand with U.S. corporations like the Riggs Bank, which was being run at the time by George H.W. Bush's brother, Jonathan Bush. So basically, there was a big emergence of all these U.S. corporations starting to put their hands into Russia and grab up all this Russian property, and there was a massive transfer of wealth as the Russian treasury was looted. Essentially, there was these auctions trying to get these former communal properties. These auctions were basically being rigged and given to selective oligarchs in both Russia and the United States. And then the Russian oligarchs were using banks in the US, like the Bank of New York and Riggs Bank, to launder their money. So basically, this whole thing, this operation by the Bush administration and the Clinton administration after that to privatize things, was being run, was led to the deliberate creation of the Russian oligarchy and the Russian mafia, which are kind of one and the same. So that's just an interesting background on that. And the architects of this economic plan, by the way, came from Harvard University, the alma mater of Victor Kozeny as well. So involving people like Larry Summers in the Clinton administration and others from Harvard as well. So anyway, this is just to give the context of what Victor Kozeny is up to. Victor Kozeny is involved in this check voucher scheme where he claims that he'll give you an amazing return on your investment. And this made a bunch of him and his business partners very rich, but it really didn't work out for the rest of the people in the Czech Republic. And he was wanted on criminal charges, but he fled. So some of the people involved in the scheme, by the way, one of them was George H.W. Bush's chief of staff and a Council for National Policy member named John Sununu, who was the former New Hampshire governor. So that's another interesting CNP connection to pop up there. And he also is believed to have engineered George Bush's New Hampshire primary win in 1988. Now, Victor Kozeny, he makes a lot of money off of this scheme, and then he ends up fleeing to the U.S. and to the Bahamas, where he starts buying up a bunch of properties. He actually buys up a major property, a chalet in Aspen, Colorado. And in 1997, in Christmas 1997, Victor Kozeny throws a huge party where he invites the rich and the powerful of Aspen high society to this event. And some of the guests there include Ivana Trump. They also include people like Goldie Hawn and Natalie Cole. And just to digress for a moment, some people here are familiar with my work on the John Benet Ramsey case and how that ties into these brownstone operations going on in Colorado. And it is interesting to note that the best friend of John Benet's father was a man named Fleet White Jr., who was an oil company executive. And Fleet White Jr.'s father, Fleet White Sr., lived in Aspen. He was part of Aspen High Society as well, and he had also had a good relationship with actress Goldie Hawn. He had been photographed with her, invited her to some New Year's parties in the late 90s. So Fleet White himself was an oil man, part of this whole Aspen High Society group as well. And given what I'm about to talk about, how Victor Kozeny was involved in oil privatization in Azerbaijan, it's interesting to wonder if Fleet White himself had any overlap with this group, because Fleet White Sr. and Jr., along with John Benet Ramsey's father, John Ramsey, have all been accused of involvement in pedophile rings. So digressing again from that, the Victor Kozeny basically at this party hatched a scheme where he and a bunch of other investors would go to privatize the oil industry in Azerbaijan. And the people who he brought on board for the scheme were a couple of very interesting people. One of them was Frederick Bork, who ran a handbag company. And Frederick Bork was the neighbor of Kozeny in Aspen, Colorado. He got Frederick Bork on board with this scheme. Another person who he got on board with this scheme was he got the American International Group, a big insurance giant who also shows up in some other roles with 9/11, but we may not get to that today. AIG has been involved in Iran-Contra money laundering with the Arkansas Development Finance Authority. It has a long history of intelligence involvement dating back to an OSS officer, Cornelius van der Star, being a founding member, and then Hank Greenberg, who was at one point considered by Bill Clinton as CIA director, becoming the chief executive of AIG afterwards. So AIG has a long history of involvement with the U.S. intelligence community, and in fact, the person who Victor Kozeny dealt with at AIG was Frank Gardner Wisner Jr., who is the son of Frank Gardner Wisner Sr., an infamous CIA agent who once boasted that he could play the media like a mighty Wurlitzer. So Victor Kozini dealt with AIG and he brought them into the scheme. And the person who he dealt with a CIA person at AIG and specifically got a man named David Pinkerton to be involved with the Azerbaijan venture. Now, a couple other interesting people who got involved was George Mitchell, and George Mitchell was a former Democratic senator from Maine, Senate Majority Leader, and now a Clinton administration diplomat to Ireland. And George Mitchell, of course, has been in the news recently because of his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. Virginia Giuffre has claimed that she was forced to have sex with him, with George Mitchell, as part of Epstein's pedophile network. So George Mitchell was brought into the scheme with Victor Kozini, and also brought into the scheme with Victor Kozini was a Swiss lawyer named Hans Bodmer. And Hans Bodmer also showed up in a corruption scheme involving Alpha Bank in Russia. And this scheme in Russia, he was involved with a man named Peter Oven, who was a known drug trafficker, and so this whole scandal started to erupt in early 2000, and Dick Cheney's Halliburton was actually in business with the Alpha Group while this was going on. So you have all these people, all these connections to U.S. intelligence, to Russian oligarchs, Russian organized crime, and also Jeffrey Epstein's crowd. All these people are getting involved with Victor Kozini in this Azerbaijan venture, which ultimately turns out to be a total fraud. And so eventually, Victor Kozini ends up fleeing justice. All these other people who were involved with him turn the blame on him and claim that they had nothing to do with it, that they were defrauded by him. And basically, a couple of these people go down on various charges, like Frederick Bork does, Hans Bodmer does, David Pinkerton does, but George Mitchell actually gets off entirely, and he claimed that he was just totally an innocent victim, and he didn't have any corrupt dealings, even though he was being sent by Victor Kozini to basically lobby and get an audience with Azerbaijan's leadership. So it basically, Victor Kozini just has a really interesting background that sort of betrays the likelihood that he, has worked for U.S. intelligence and essentially does the same privatization work that U.S. intelligence does to support the creation of the Russian mafia and Russian oligarchy and Russian organized crime. So that just gets into the background of Victor Kozini and the fact that he was partnered up with George Mitchell, who was an Epstein associate, the fact that he was also partnered up with Frederick Bork, who appears in Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book, the fact that he has a background similar to Jeffrey Epstein, and also the fact that Wolfgang Boehringer, who was the personal pilot of Kozini, the Wolfgang Boehringer ran some yacht businesses in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, and is believed to have done diving expeditions at Little St. James Island. That's three possible connections between Jeffrey Epstein and Victor Kozini right there, not to mention how similar they are to each other. So it's just very curious to see Victor Kozini be implicated in this whole pedophile ring brownstone operation that was the backdrop of 9/11, and to see Jeffrey Epstein overlap with that as well. Just a very curious thing, and again, a big clue into the actual global network behind 9/11. And it wasn't just Islamists, it wasn't just Saudis, it was all that and far more. U.S. intelligence, Russian mob, Israeli intelligence, all of these groups are so thoroughly linked up with each other that you can't really separate any of them. They're all just working together for their personal enrichment, working together for their own interests, which overlap in many, many ways.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so, George. And like you said, it connects to the Council for National Policy, the Council on Foreign Relations, intelligence networks throughout the whole world. The Five Eyes, is Israel, Russia, probably the Kremlin, Russian oligarchs. I mean, Pakistan. It's more than just Saudi Arabian hijackers with box cutters and Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And that's what
absolutely.
a majority of people are going to say it as. And it has connections to all of these groups, and most people are not going to talk about all of these groups together. They're only going to talk about certain ones that make their interests. People who only talk about the Mossad Israeli interests but leave out the Russian connections, or people that only talk about the Saudi Arabia connections, or only the Five Eye connections. So yeah, I mean, we try to encompass all of it here today, and there's very few people that try to do that, like the Antidote podcast or Josh Reeves, and you and I myself, and some people may do one or the other or focus on that alone, but to try to put it all together, to try to put all the arms of the octopus together and wrap it around his head is something very difficult, something that we tried to attempt to do today. And
Absolutely.
we'll have to do another shows too as well. We'll probably do another show next 11/9 on 9/11 again. But you did bring information to the table that no one's ever talked about, and I definitely want to appreciate you coming on and you talking about the brownstone operations surrounding 9/11.
Yeah, thank you. And I think many people who listen to this may be a bit unsatisfied because I didn't just make a definitive claim like, oh yeah, it was definitely Dick Cheney or it was definitely the Mossad who did 9/11, because there isn't really an easy answer to this. And that's not the way that intelligence operations work. And the reality is that whenever you limit your focus to just one group, you're not actually getting the full picture and you're kind of just ignoring evidence that you shouldn't be ignoring. If you look at any one of these groups, if you try to look at the Saudis, you find the fact that the Saudis are doing business with Wally Hilliard, for example, that he's that he's flying Saudi out of the country, that he's working with Saudis. If you try to look at the Mossad, you see the Russian organized crime connections, you see the CIA connections. There's basically, because that's what this octopus actually is. It's not one country, it's not one corporation, it's not one intelligence agency. It's all of this stuff working together for their mutual interests and in a very loose-knit set of alliances. It may not be easy or possible to identify exactly who did 9/11, exactly who was responsible for initiating the plan, but what we can find are the ground level operatives, of who was in charge and all these different handlers, and start to piece that back together and start to get a sense of who is running the show. And that's the valuable insight to take away, that our a glimpse into our deep political system and the whole environment that was behind 9/11. It may not be an easy answer, but it starts to shed light and will hopefully bring us closer to getting actual answers in lieu of a official investigation, which unfortunately the ball's been dropped on that and will probably never be picked up again.
Very much so, George. All right, say goodbye to everybody. Thank you for coming on, man. We've been planning this show and looking forward to it for a very long time. I want to thank you for all the research that you did for this. I cannot thank you enough. You're a dear friend and an excellent researcher, a walking encyclopedia. People were telling you and saying in the chats. They loved you, George.
Wow.
Say goodbye, everybody.
Yeah, it was great being here. I hope to be back soon, and you do amazing work as well, John. I'm glad to consider you a friend as well.
Thank you, George. Take care. Bye.
You too.
All right, that's it for this episode. Thank you, Alex, for the super chat at the very end. I greatly appreciate it. Go support George over at cavdev.org. I'll put his PayPal in the show notes. George is a dear friend and an excellent researcher, one of the new guard of researchers that is out there, that is trying to bring research to the forefront. And trying to bring it out there. Hopefully we'll get a group of us together and try to put all these connections out there for you guys and try to cover more topics. I'm going to do some Finders episodes this week. I'm going to do some CMP episodes this week. Probably going to have someone else, but y'all take care. Have a good day. Take care.